AITA for storming off after I refusing pay restaurant bill for my fiance's sisters. Alright, so at 27 male need to know if I'm the jerk here because this situation blew up way more than I thought it would. For a bit of context, I've been with my fiance 26 female for about 5 years, and we've known each other practically our whole lives. Our families are really close, like the kind of close where our parents regularly hang out and even vacation together. I've also known my soon-to-be sister-in-law Sil, 22 female for years, and she's always been a kind and supportive person. She's studying computer science at a university far away, so she rarely visits, and when she does, it's a pretty big deal. Anyway, last week, my Sil decided to come back to town for the holidays, which I was genuinely excited about. She's usually super busy with her studies and doesn't visit much during the year, so it was a nice surprise. My fiance was thrilled too and said she wanted to plan a special dinner to welcome her sister back. She mentioned that she was thinking of booking a table at a fancy restaurant that recently opened up in town. I had heard about this place, and while I knew it was upscale, I didn't think much of it because my fiancé knows my financial situation well, and I assumed she was handling it. I'm not exactly rolling in cash, and we've always been pretty good at budgeting around that. So, the day comes, and I'm honestly looking forward to it. I dressed up a bit nicer than usual because I knew the place was fancy, and we headed out to meet my Sil. We were all smiles and catching up as we got to the restaurant, and it was a great vibe. The restaurant itself was really nice, dim lighting, fancy decor, the whole 9 yards. We were shown to our table, and I noticed the menu didn't have any prices listed, which is never a great sign. But again, I trusted that my fiance had planned this, so I figured it would be fine. As we're looking over the menu, my Sil starts excitedly talking about how she's been craving some specific dishes, and she orders a few of the priciest things on the menu. I'm talking about appetizers, a main course, dessert, and drinks. She was really going all out. My fiance joined in and got herself a nice meal as well. I decided to play it safe and ordered a steak that was about $25 converted to USD, which I thought was reasonable. I honestly didn't want to overstep, but I was also under the impression that this was their treat, considering how they both were ordering. The whole dinner was nice. We were chatting about my Sil's classes, how she's been managing with her workload, some funny stories from university life, and all the family stuff. It was a really good time, and I thought we were all on the same page here. But then the bill came, and it was around $300. Now, I'm not sure how it works in other countries, but tipping isn't really a big thing where we are. You can do it, but it's not expected, so the $300 was basically just the cost of the food. My heart sort of dropped when I saw the bill because that was way out of my budget for a single meal. I'm talking more than I'd spend on groceries for a week, maybe even 2. I glanced at the total again, just to make sure I wasn't seeing things, but there it was, $300 staring back at me, mocking me. At that moment, I felt a mix of shock, anxiety, and a bit of dread because, while I'm all for having a nice meal, there was no way I was comfortable dropping that kind of money in one go. But I still didn't panic because I had assumed my fiance, or Sil, would handle it. After all, they'd been the ones planning this dinner and ordering up a storm, and my fiance knew full well that my finances didn't exactly have room for splurging on a high-end restaurant bill. So, I was still calm, maybe even a little hopeful, thinking, alright, one of them's got this. That's when my fiance glanced at me and subtly nodded toward my wallet, like she expected me to pick up the bill. It was a tiny gesture, but it felt like a slap in the face. I could feel my heart rate pick up because, up until that moment, I genuinely thought we were all on the same page, that this was their treat or that we'd at least be splitting it. I tried to maintain my composure and shook my head slightly, hoping she'd catch the hint and understand that I wasn't comfortable with covering the whole bill. Maybe she'd say, "Oh, don't worry, we'll split it," or even, "We've got this, just chip in what you can." But no, instead, she leaned in closer, squinting, like she was trying to figure out why I wasn't jumping at the opportunity to pay for everyone's meal. She looked visibly frustrated, and I could almost see the wheels turning in her head, like she was trying to telepathically force me into doing what she wanted. It was incredibly uncomfortable, and I suddenly felt like I was the one being difficult or unreasonable, even though I was just trying to protect my own financial stability. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my cool, and quietly said, "How about we just split it 50-50ths? That's usually how we handle our meals if we're out somewhere nice, so I figured that was a fair and reasonable suggestion, no big deal, right?" I thought we could move past the awkwardness quickly and just wrap things up. But before I could even finish my sentence, my fiance cut me off. She didn't just cut me off, she practically snapped at the waiter, raising her voice a bit and saying, "He'll be paying for all of it." I couldn't believe it. It wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it, like it was a fact that everyone but me had already agreed upon. I felt my face flush, and I could see the waiter glance between us, trying to figure out what was going on. And then, as if on cue, my Sil immediately chimed in, backing her up, saying, "Yeah, come on, it's just this one time." She said it in this kind of playful, dismissive way, like it was no big deal for me to shell out $300 and I was just being stingy or stubborn for not wanting to. I was stunned. I sat there, blinking, trying to process what had just happened because, honestly, this wasn't something we'd discussed at all beforehand, and I felt completely blindsided. My brain was scrambling to make sense of why they would think this was okay or why they'd even plan for me to cover the whole thing without mentioning it to me in advance. Look, I'm all for treating people, especially family. I get it, sometimes you want to do something nice, and I'm usually more than happy to chip in or cover the bill if I can. But $300 for a single meal? That was not something I had in my budget, and they both knew it. We're not talking about a little bit over budget, either. This was a massive jump, and it felt so inconsiderate, like they didn't even think about how this might affect me or my plans. The whole thing just felt so manipulative, like they were using the situation to force me into paying, and I felt cornered. It was like they set up this whole scenario where I'd be guilted into covering the cost because, what? I'm the guy and that's what I'm supposed to do. It felt like a trap, and I was incredibly frustrated because it wasn't fair. It was embarrassing, too, like they were trying to paint me as cheap or ungrateful, when I was just being practical about my own financial situation. I didn't want to make a scene, but I was also feeling super frustrated and kind of humiliated that they put me on the spot like this. It was like the walls of the restaurant were closing in on me, and I could feel all the eyes around us, even if no one was actually paying attention. So, I made a decision. I calmly took out my wallet, pulled out $25, and left it on the table along with the $2 tip. I then looked at the waiter, who was still hovering there awkwardly, and said, "They'll handle the rest." It felt surreal, like I was watching myself from outside my body, but I knew I couldn't sit there and be pushed around. I needed to leave, to get some air, to just be away from this whole mess for a bit. Without saying another word, I stood up, walked out of the restaurant, and headed straight for my car, my heart pounding the entire time. I know, it was probably a bit dramatic, but I just couldn't stand sitting there and being cornered like that. I left, got in my car, and drove back to our apartment. On the way, my phone was blowing up with texts and calls from my fiance, but I just didn't have it in me to respond. I needed to cool off. About 35 minutes later, she stormed into the apartment, visibly upset, and we had a huge argument. She kept saying how I embarrassed her and her sister, that I was being childish and could have just paid this one time. She even said I ruined what was supposed to be a nice evening and that I acted selfishly. I tried to explain how I felt completely blindsided and that it wasn't fair for her to put me in that position, especially since she knows my financial situation. I pointed out that if this was something they wanted me to do, a heads up would have been nice so I could plan accordingly. But she just kept going on about how I overreacted and made it a bigger deal than it needed to be. The next morning, I woke up with a heavy feeling in my chest. My fiance and I hadn't spoken much after our argument. She had slept on the couch, and I spent the night in our bedroom, tossing and turning, replaying everything that happened at the restaurant. I was still trying to make sense of why she thought it was okay to put me on the spot like that. I felt blindsided and humiliated, and I couldn't shake off the feeling that there was something deeper going on here. I was still angry, but more than that, I was confused. I kept hoping that maybe after a night apart, she would see things from my perspective and we could have a reasonable conversation about it. I was in the middle of making myself some coffee when my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number, and I almost ignored it, but a gut feeling made me pick up. I said, "Hello," and for a few seconds, There was silence on the other end. Then I heard my Syl's voice, and my stomach sank. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I certainly wasn't prepared for what came next. She launched into this whole thing about how she was upset and disappointed in me for leaving them at the restaurant the night before. I was still half asleep, trying to wake up with my coffee, and suddenly I was being hit with this barrage of criticism. She was saying how rude it was for me to walk out like that, how embarrassing it was for her and my fiancé, and how I had made a big scene for no reason. I could barely get a word in, and when I finally did, I said something along the lines of, "I'm sorry, but I didn't agree to pay for that meal, and I wasn't comfortable covering such an expensive bill." That's when she said it, "You owe me $300. I was taken aback, literally speechless for a few seconds, because I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It's like the ground shifted beneath me. I hadn't even realized that was what she was getting at. I was confused and a little bit angry because I didn't owe her anything. I never agreed to pay for her meal, and the fact that she was now calling me and demanding that I reimburse her for a dinner I never planned to pay for was just absurd. But she wasn't done. She kept going, saying things like, "You're the guy, it's your responsibility to cover the bill, especially when you're out with family." She even said that it didn't matter if the bill was $100 or $1,000, men should just pay, end of story. She said it like it was some universal truth, like I was the one who was out of line for not following this unwritten rule. I felt my blood boiling because, frankly, I found her logic ridiculous. I tried to keep my cool, but I told her, flat out, that I didn't owe her $300, and I wasn't going to pay her back. I said that this whole situation felt unfair and that it wasn't my job to fund an expensive dinner just because I'm a guy. She didn't like that at all. She started raising her voice, saying things about how she's used to men paying for her, that it's how things have always been done, and that my behavior was making her question what kind of man I was. She said I was embarrassing my fiancé by acting this way, and she didn't understand how I could be so stubborn and selfish. I was honestly in shock. I knew she had a traditional mindset, but this was something else entirely. The fact that she was going out of her way to call me and basically berate me for not adhering to her outdated standards was just mind-boggling. I was fuming, but I kept telling her that I wasn't going to pay and that this whole situation was inappropriate. Finally, she just hung up, but not before throwing in some last comment about how I needed to man up and make things right. I sat there for a few minutes, staring at my phone, trying to process everything. I was already feeling uneasy after the argument with my fiancé the night before, and now this. It was like the whole world had turned upside down. I thought I was doing the right thing by standing up for myself, but now I felt like I was being made out to be the villain. I didn't want to cause any more drama, but I also knew I couldn't just let this slide. I needed to talk to my fiancé and try to sort this out, hoping she would be on my side this time. When she finally woke up and came into the kitchen, she looked tired, like she hadn't slept much either. I could tell she was still upset, but I figured now was as good a time as any to talk. I brought up the call with her sister, explaining how uncomfortable it made me, and how I felt like it was completely out of line for her to demand $300 from me. I tried to stay calm, but I could feel my frustration creeping into my voice. I was hoping my fiancé would understand, that maybe she'd be surprised her sister called and agree that it was inappropriate. But that's not what happened. Instead, she just sighed and said, "Well, I understand where she's coming from." I remember just staring at her, not quite believing what I was hearing. She started saying that her sister was used to a certain way of things, that whenever she went out with her friends or family, the men would usually cover the bill, and that's just how it's always been. She even said that she felt embarrassed the night before, when I didn't immediately offer to pay because it made her sister feel uncomfortable. She said that, as her fiancé, I should have known that this was my responsibility, and the fact that I didn't want to pay made the whole situation awkward for everyone involved. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Here I was thinking we were partners, equals, that we could talk about things and make decisions together. But now, it felt like she was saying I had to conform to some outdated idea of masculinity just to keep up appearances. I tried to explain my side again, that I didn't appreciate being blindsided with a $300 bill, and that it wasn't about not wanting to treat them, it was about not being able to. But she just kept saying that it shouldn't have mattered, that I should have manned up and paid without making a fuss, and that I embarrassed her in front of her sister by making it clear I wasn't willing to play along. I was shocked. I felt like everything I thought I understood about our relationship was suddenly being thrown into question. It wasn't just about the money anymore, it was about respect, communication, and how we saw each other's roles. I thought we had an understanding, but now I felt like she was trying to put me in a box I didn't fit into, and I didn't know how to handle it. I didn't want to keep arguing, so I just said, "Okay," and walked out of the room. I needed to clear my head and figure out what to do next because, at this point, it wasn't just about the dinner or even the $300, it was about whether this was something I could live with long term. A few days after the whole fiasco at the restaurant, things between my fiance and me were still tense. We weren't really talking much. It was like there was this invisible wall between us. I was still trying to make sense of everything that had happened and hoping that maybe she would see how unfair the whole situation was. I wanted to believe that the call from her sister was just a misunderstanding, and that once we had a proper conversation, we could move past this. One morning, my fiance casually mentioned that she was going out with her sister for lunch. At first, I felt a wave of relief. I thought maybe this would be a chance for her to talk to her sister, explain things, and smooth everything over. It was clear that there were still unresolved issues, and I naively thought that once they had a chance to chat, her sister might back off and realize how unreasonable she'd been. My fiance didn't say much about where they were going or what their plans were, just that they'd be spending the afternoon together. I hoped that when she came back, we could finally have a real conversation and put all this behind us. I went about my day trying not to think too much about it, but my phone buzzed in the early afternoon, and I saw it was another call from an unknown number. My stomach tightened, and I hesitated for a moment before picking up. Sure enough, it was my cell again. This time, her tone was light, almost playful, which threw me off because I wasn't sure where this was going. She wasted no time getting to the point. She told me that she and my fiance were at this high-end restaurant in town, and they'd just finished their meal. The bill had come, and it was a whopping $500. I could feel my heart rate spike as she casually mentioned the total, and before I could say anything, she said, "Well, here's your chance to make things right. You can come down here and pay for us, like a real man would." I was stunned. I didn't even know how to respond. It felt like a joke, but I could tell from her tone that she wasn't messing around. It was like she was giving me an ultimatum, as if this was my opportunity to redeem myself in her eyes. The absurdity of it all hit me, and I actually laughed, out of sheer disbelief more than anything. I couldn't wrap my head around how this was happening again, or why she thought I would even consider agreeing to this. I didn't say much. I just hung up the phone because I didn't know what else to do. I tried to move on and not let it get to me, but about 10 minutes later, my phone rang again, and this time it was my fiance. I hesitated before answering, already knowing this wasn't going to be a pleasant conversation. The moment I picked up, she started arguing, asking why I hadn't agreed to pay the bill when her sister called me. She was going on about how embarrassed she felt, how her sister was starting to think I wasn't reliable, and how I was making things worse. It felt like she was trying to guilt-trip me into feeling bad for not rushing over to rescue them from the bill. The way she was talking, you'd think I had done something terrible by refusing to play along with this charade. I was shocked, all over again. I couldn't believe she was siding with her sister on this, after everything that had happened. I thought maybe there was still hope that she would understand my perspective, but it was becoming clearer that she was standing firmly by her sister's side. She kept saying how this was my chance to prove myself, to show that I wasn't cheap or whatever, and that I was only making things more difficult by not going along with it. I didn't even know what to say. I felt like I was being pushed into a corner, like no matter what I did, I was somehow the bad guy in this situation. After a few more minutes of her arguing, she hung up on me, clearly upset. I couldn't believe that my fiance, the person I thought I could trust and rely on, was siding with her sister over this. It was like everything I thought I knew about our relationship was being turned upside down, and I didn't know how to make sense of it. I wanted to talk to her, to explain my side and try to make her understand, but it felt like she wasn't even willing to listen. As if that wasn't enough, my phone buzzed again, and this time it was a text. I opened it, and my heart sank. It was from my cell, and she had written out a message saying that now I owed her $800, $300 from the first dinner and $500 from this latest one. She wrote it like it was some sort of running tab, like I had an outstanding debt to her that needed to be settled. I felt like I was losing my mind. How had things spiraled this far out of control? I thought about replying, but I didn't even know what to say. Nothing I could think of would make this situation any less insane, and I felt completely powerless. When my fiancée got home later that evening, I could tell she was still upset. She barely looked at me when she walked through the door, and I could feel this heavy tension in the air. I didn't know how to start the conversation, but I knew I had to say something, so I brought up the text message from her sister. I tried to explain, again, that I didn't owe her sister anything, and that this whole situation was unreasonable, but she didn't want to hear it. She jumped straight into another argument, saying how I was embarrassing her in front of her sister, how this wasn't a big deal, and how she just wanted me to do the right thing. She kept saying how her sister was used to a certain standard that men should pay, and that I was making her look bad by refusing to play along. I felt like I was in a losing battle, trying to explain my side when it was clear she didn't want to listen. She kept throwing the same arguments at me, saying that if I was serious about our relationship, I should be willing to make her and her family happy. I felt like she was twisting everything around, trying to guilt me into giving in, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. It wasn't about the money anymore, it was about the principle. I didn't want to set a precedent where I was expected to cover these kinds of expenses just to keep the peace, especially when it was clear that my own feelings and boundaries weren't being respected. The argument dragged on, and by the end of it, I felt completely drained. She eventually stormed off, leaving me alone in the apartment, and I was left wondering how things had gotten to this point. I kept replaying everything in my head, trying to figure out if I had done something wrong, if I had missed some critical piece of information that would make all of this make sense. But I kept coming back to the same conclusion. I didn't agree to pay for those meals, and I wasn't comfortable being pressured into doing something that felt so wrong. Now I'm sitting here, wondering if I'm the asshole in all of this. I don't want to be the kind of person who makes things difficult for my partner, but I also don't want to be taken advantage of. I thought we had an understanding, but now I'm not so sure. I feel like I'm being punished for trying to set a boundary, and I don't know how to move forward from here. Is it really so unreasonable to expect clear communication and respect for each other's limits? Am I AITA?